Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Nonprofit Learning Lab for today's workshop. If you have any questions along the way for our presenter, you can type them into the question box on your GoTo control panel, which is likely on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any tech questions, you can also type them there. If you're interested in using live captions for today's workshop, you can use the link that we'll send in the chat shortly. If you're interested in receiving the recording and materials for today's free webinar, you can visit our free webinars page on the Nonprofit Learning Lab website, or you can send us an email at program@nonprofitlearninglab.org. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Crystal.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. My name is Crystal Coates, and I am excited to be presenting to you all today about setting up group norms and agreements. So a little bit about Legacy Consulting Group. We are a social impact consultancy located here just outside of Chicago, but working nationwide. And we support our partners on making the work. So really thinking about social impact strategy, what you need in order to get the work done, and really understanding the challenges that you're trying to address. As for me, my name is Crystal Coates. I am a 20-year nonprofit professional, really specializing in impact and program strategy. And I've had a lot of experience working across various sectors, especially in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice space, arts and culture, education, youth programming, but really working all over the social impact sector. So today we're really going to focus on group norms and agreements, and we're going to hit three main points. Why would you ever do this? So why would you use a group norm or agreement? What do they look like and how do they work? So why use group norms and agreements? Really, a group norm or a group agreement is a tool. It's a tool for helping you get the work done. So one, it adds transparency. It helps explain very clearly to folks what the expectations are, what roles are, and especially what success will look like, which is always key to completing a project. It's an accountability tool as well. It provides a point of reference for the entirety of your group to really think about what are you doing and what are the guidelines that we set out at the very beginning. This is especially great for groups where roles might shift as the work changes over time, where decisions are complex. We know a lot of the big decisions we're making are very nuanced, so it helps to have group norms and agreements in place as the work gets very muddy as you're doing it, and where you're bringing groups of individuals together. So think about sometimes you're doing this in a community space, or sometimes you're doing this with another partner or another business. So group norms and agreements really help to level set with everybody involved. And last but not least, it's an engagement tool. So when you're thinking about groups where you might want to build more buy-in or really providing a space where group members can contribute, these are excellent tools for doing that. So what's the difference between group norms and group agreements? A group norm is really more about what you do when you're together. So it's really about the processes that are guiding the group, and really thinking about how you lay out those processes clearly so everyone knows what to expect when doing the work of the group. A group agreement centers more around what do you value? So really calling out and being very clear, what are the values that are undergirding the work and guiding how you make decisions? And that's especially key, as we said, when some of the work can get a little murky. Having something in place that helps inform your decision making and can be that guidepost for you so you know when it comes time to make a decision what you're going to use or what you're going to set that decision around. So a couple of examples. Group norms. How many of us would love working on a group where we say the meetings always start on time? We've all been in those meetings where you're not sure when it's going to start or when you need to show up. So having a group norm around our meetings will start on time can be especially helpful. There might be times where you actually want the inverse of that. So actually planning into the group, each one of our meetings is going to start with 5 minutes of networking at the very top. That's a group norm that you can set for yourself. So really helping to get people to understand the expectations of what it's going to be like to work on that group. Another great example, having agendas and ending each meeting with action items. So really thinking about how are you explaining what is the content of that conversation going to be, and then what the work will be leading out of that. And it's a great tool for helping to ensure that everyone stays on task and that the work actually gets done. Now, group norms aren't good for just meetings, but they are a really helpful tool when you're bringing groups of people together. Another great one that I like to use, we will consider who needs the information and share it. And that goes along with that last one at the bottom. If the content isn't directly applicable, you don't have to be there. I've managed a lot of groups, particularly large working groups, where everybody feels like they have to be there all the time. And then the group work just becomes another burden. It becomes another barrier to getting the rest of your work done throughout the week. So really setting that norm of, hey, if there's nothing that you need to be here for, there's not a decision that we need your input on, there's not information or training you need to receive, you don't have to be here. And allowing your group to make that decision for themselves really helps to build trust within the group. So setting these norms around who needs to be here, who is the recipient of the information, and especially with that last one, if I'm saying you don't need to be here if there's nothing directly applicable for you, well, having a norm in the group saying we will share this information out later really helps to encourage people to take advantage of that. So really saying, I trust you to get the information in your own time and be prepared to fully engage in the group when it's time for you to engage. This last one I just want to highlight, especially in the time that we're in now, where we're transitioning back to the office, many of us, setting a norm around what makes a meeting need to be in person can be very key. So making sure that the group understands, here are the conditions and the criteria where I would ask you to show up in person versus a virtual meeting where you can attend from your home or your desk. Oftentimes, some of us are working in spaces where you might have a virtual setup at your desk and a meeting held in a conference room. Do I actually need to go and physically sit in that conference room, or can I take this meeting from my desk? So really being able to call out what are the norms and the practices. This is also key, again, when you're working with partners or working in community, when do you need to show up? It might be a lot easier for your partners to attend a meeting virtually than it is to attend in person. And that can really help in thinking about how the work gets done, setting these norms and understanding around how you use your time. So some examples of group agreements and what these can look like. We will treat each other with respect. It seems very simple, but the number of times you need to actually call that out. We are going to respect each other in this space, and how far that can go for helping your group understand what it will be like to work together and really understand what they're committing to by being a part of this group. What that immediately says is, if there's someone in this group you feel like you cannot respect, then we need to have a conversation about how you engage in this group or if you engage in this group. So really being clear about how you will be together when you are together. Another great one I want to point out, we recognize that people process information differently and will make space for diverse ways of participating. I love this one for a very specific reason. We all know that neurodiversity exists. There are people who process information differently. Some people need to read it, some people need to hear it, some people need to do a combination or actually do an activity to help them understand what the information is. By setting an agreement like this and saying that you recognize that people might be processing information differently, well, then that triggers you doing an additional action. So now you need to actually set up the experience so that those different processors have different means of engaging in the content, right? So you're making an agreement. Yes, we all agree that we understand that folks process information differently, and that is leading us to a group norm. Things like you might want to say, we will give information out ahead of the meeting for folks who need longer to process information, right? So that they can show up and fully participate. So this really is about, how do you prepare your group so that they can show up to whatever the group setting is whatever the work is you're asking them to do, and fully participate at their best. That's why we want to do these things. Another one I want to call out, which is another great one, especially for us, those of us who work on these complex issues. We accept that ambiguity exists and will not force decisions when we don't have enough information to make a decision. There are so many times we feel like we need to come to a conclusion within the span of a meeting when we just don't. When you need to be able to admit, hey, we don't have enough information here to make an informed decision. So a group agreement is a chance to call out at the very beginning some things that you know exist, but you may not feel comfortable really calling them out as the work is being done. So creating a place and a space where you call everyone to the table and say, what are some things that we want to acknowledge that are impacting our work? How are we understanding that? And how do we want to deal with that together? So it becomes a really great tool for developing that team buy-in and building out that trust in your team. And we all know how important trust is to actually getting the work done. Mistrust becomes a huge barrier. It leads to miscommunication, it leads to confusion. So these group agreements really help address that. So a few simple tips on how it works, some 5 really simple strategies and steps to consider. First is identify who is in your quote unquote group. So it's really key here to use those quotes around group. Sometimes we think about our group as just the people who are immediately in the room. But as we recognize when we were talking about group norms, there might be people who are not in that room, in that space at that immediate time, who are a part of that group. So say, for example, you are meeting with a community stakeholder who represents either a larger organization or a larger community of people or demographic. How are the needs of that group being represented in the work that your group is doing? So really thinking about who is being impacted by our work and how do we need to consider them in what we do? How do we also understand the individuals who are in the room and what they need? So for example, you might be working on work that has impact in a particular demographic, right? You might need to put into your group agreement, we understand that there are stereotypes about this demographic. We understand that there's a way that the data shows up that tells the story of this demographic, but we also understand that demographic is not present in this room. So how does that change the way that we work together? What are the norms that we can set around that? Maybe it's we will go and seek out unique voices to help inform our opinions, right? What are the agreements that you need to have? Do you recognize that? Can you call that out? Hey, we're doing this work about this other group that is not present today, and have an agreement around that. So really thinking about who is being impacted by your work and how they need to be represented in your norms and in your group agreements. The second one, clarify what roles exist. So within any group, there are roles. That's just how groups function. That's how the work gets done. These roles might shift on and off, and you can determine that and set that up within your group norms and agreements. So for example, you might have seen on the group norms slide, designate a note taker for your meetings, right? That note taker doesn't have to be the same person every time. In fact, if we're trying to embed equity into our work, it's actually beneficial to have that person switch off and have that role not necessarily be designated by your job title, right? So really thinking about what roles exist. Is there someone in your group by definition of their title and their position within the organization, if you're a hierarchical organization, that requires them to be a decision maker? So how do you set norms around that? They may not be the person who's actually supplying input into the decision, but they are still the decision maker. So this is where norms like thinking about who needs the information comes into play. That person, that decision maker, may not be present at every meeting of your group, but they still need that information. So setting a norm around sharing information, how often it will be shared, by whom, and what it will look like can be very influential to the management of your group. That means that that decision maker can decide, hey, you guys got it. I don't need to show up. I don't need to micromanage. You understand I have a decision to make, and you're going to get me the information I need to make that decision, right? So really being clear on the roles that are existing in the work is very key to ensuring that your group work come together and to set these group norms and agreements. Determining the content and purpose of the group. I can speak for myself, but I'm sure this resonates with a lot of you. The times that you have been in a group and you're like, why am I here? What are we actually trying to do? Again, this is where the norm around setting an agenda can come into play. The agenda should clearly call out what is the content of the conversation that we're having, right? What are we actually trying to accomplish here? And if you need a written agenda in order to accomplish that, if the work and the content of your conversations is very nuanced or has a lot of steps, a lot of things that you need to cover, an agenda, having a norm of having an agenda for every meeting could be very helpful, right? Last but not least, or second to last, but not second to least, is you want to ask the group what it needs to function. So 9 times out of 10, the person putting together these group norms and agreements is usually 1 or 2 people, right? So what becomes key is that those 1 or 2 people ask the rest of the group, what do you need out of this? What do you need in order to show up and fully participate, right? Do you need someone to be able to give you notes? Do you need closed captioning? Do you need physical access to a building, right? So these are all things that you want to take into consideration as you're forming your group and as you're setting your group agreements. One of the ones I loved on a group that I was recently in with a large group of stakeholders across many different states coming together, and they said, what should we put in a group agreement? I said, we should be able to ask for what we need, right? There's a lot of politics in our room right now based off the work that we're doing, and there might be a hesitancy to ask for what we actually need because we're trying to measure what are people expecting from me and what are the politics existing, right? So calling out at the very beginning, can we put it in our agreement that in this space at least, we are allowed to ask directly for what we need? And that really helped move the work along because it gave us permission to then have some tougher conversations. But the tougher conversations are the ones we needed to have to get the work done. And last but not least, write it down. We are still a society that leans very heavily on the written word. So if your group norms and your group agreements are truly going to be a point of reference, you need to write them down. You need to document them somewhere and then actually refer back to them. So my group norms, group agreements, when I facilitate meetings, I usually start every meeting with those. So starting every meeting with, this is our group agreement, right? And understand that they don't have to be set in stone, especially a group agreement. You might discover things along the way that you want to adapt or change. So asking people at the very beginning of a meeting, hey, this is our group agreement. This is what we agreed to at the very beginning. Is there anything we want to add? Is there anything we want to refine? Is there anything that needs to change based off of what we know now? Again, attacking that thing about ambiguity. We know it exists. And as the group does more work, you're going to learn more along the way. So how do you make space through your group agreements to incorporate that new knowledge, incorporate that new learning into the group so that you function better? You become more efficient along the way. That's the whole point of all of this. How do we make the work work? So these are 5 simple tips I wanted to give you all to forming your group norms, forming your group agreements, and really hoping you're able to take this information and implement it and use it in a practical way to help encourage your efforts and your work. Last but not least, the importance of reflection as you're doing this. As I mentioned, these group agreements, group norms are not set in stone. So really taking time to reflect. So looking at what happened, what's working, and what needs to change. And again, asking people directly how it's going for them. Don't don't be shy about the feelings part. So if someone is just says, I'm frustrated, right? That might mean you need to change your norms and agreements. How do we deal with that frustration? Because we know if you're frustrated, it makes it literally harder for you to engage in conversation, to make decisions, to contribute fully to the group. So you really want to make sure that you are asking people and engaging people in that conversation. And again, it builds that trust, it builds that engagement. Keep evaluating those roles and responsibilities and seeing where they need to change. And be transparent. Share with people, hey, here's what's going on. Here's what's influencing the space that we're in. And be transparent about how that impacts your group norms, how that impacts your group agreements, so that, like I said, so that you can update when needed. Remember that these are not meant to be punitive tools. Sometimes people hear accountability and think punishment. It's really about how do we hold each other accountable to, how do we understand and maintain what is guiding our work and the structure of our group, right? So this group norm, the group agreement, that's what it's really for, is to set that structure of your group. All right. So that's all the slides I have for you. I know we're going to open it up for questions in just a second. I will say I love talking to you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. If you liked this workshop and you want to learn more about Legacy Consulting Group, please take a picture of that tiny dinosaur on your screen, and you can join our email list, and you will receive more information about our online trainings and workshops, our advising services, and other ways that we can support you in your work. And with that, I will turn it back over to our facilitators for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Crystal. We do have a few questions. Okay, one person, Jesse, asked, curious about the decision example. Would it be reasonable for a group agreement to be, we will make a plan to seek out information to come to a decision instead of not making a decision?
I love that. I love it because it is action oriented, and that's what we often need in those settings. It's not saying, hey, we couldn't come to a decision, so therefore a decision can't be made. It's saying, in this space, with the information we have right now, we can't come to a decision that we need to make. So instead of just sitting here, we're going to take action and we're going to seek out that information. And then what that means is, according to those roles, you can say, hey, Johnny, hey, Sue, you guys are actually going to go and get that information, bring it back to the group. And as a group, we can make a decision. So I love that because it actually outlines what action needs to happen to maintain your group norms and group agreements. So I think that's a great idea.
Awesome. Another one is, it seems like for those 5 steps, they don't necessarily need to be in order except maybe number 5. Does that seem right? For instance, it seems like you could determine the roles that exist or should exist based on what the group needs to function.
You're right. They don't have to necessarily be in order. What I would say is the first 3 are really prep for your group. So those are things you do want to kind of think about before the group actually launches. And then what I typically do in this setting is use those 3 as kind of a way to start the conversation with the group. Hey, you were all invited to participate for these reasons. Is there anyone who's not here who should be here? Right? Do we all feel like we're in the right roles? Is there a role that's missing? So actually using that as the first conversation your group has to actually agree on those 3 steps. And then you can write it down, and then it just becomes the structure of your group.
Cool. Okay. We've got another from Aaliyah. Can you speak to resetting and reinforcing group norms when the norms are being ignored or disrespected?
Oh my goodness, I love it. Okay. Um, Flip back up to this slide. So this is where we get into that big A, accountability, right? So the norms are there in order to set what the group does, our processes, right? The agreements are there to say, hey, we're all agreeing to be in this space together, and we're all agreeing in this space, we're going to act these ways, right? So this is where accountability comes in. When someone is stepping outside of that norm, outside of those agreements, calling them back into that space. For me, what I always do is ask why. And there's a couple of ways that you can do that as a group leader. You can decide whether this is a side conversation with an individual or a group conversation, right? So it might be, there's one person who is just not that fun to be with on a group, right? There might be a bigger issue that's going on that's impacting several people. So you want to find space and time to ask why before you say, well, look, this is what you agreed to be a part of this group. Depending on the work that you're doing together, you have some choices, right? If this is an internal working group, it may not be the case where you can say, well, Jimmy John, you're out because you can't live into our group agreements, right? So it might be documenting this if it really is an issue of like insubordination or anything like that, documenting that and sharing it with that person's advisor. Hey, this person was in this group where we agreed to do X, Y, and Z. They're not showing up in the ways in which they're being asked to, and they're not fulfilling their role. Versus, I do a lot of community-based programming as well, and we've had issues with someone who's in a program not being able to live into the agreements. And so having that conversation with them, hey, is this really the best place for you? Is this really something that you feel like you can commit to? That can also cross over to, I know there's a lot of internal like staff engagement groups now. So in those situations, those spaces, hey, this is the purpose and the function of this group. Is this something that you feel like you can live into, because being a part of this group is voluntary? You don't have to be here. But in order to maintain this space and keep it safe and working for everyone else, this is what we're asking you to agree to, right? They're tough conversations and they are never fun. But a lot of times what ends up happening is you end up discovering a way to improve the group, or a way to evolve the group that benefits a lot more people. So definitely encouraging first starting with that conversation. Why is this happening?
Awesome. Okay. All right, we've got a couple more. I'm on a staff team of 6 people. Do you have any tips for smaller groups?
Smaller groups are great because a lot of this gets a lot more flexible with a small group, especially a small group that's doing a lot of work. The biggest tip that I would say for you or a small group is actually this: the importance of reflection. So with a smaller group, you have a lot more opportunity to ask that question, is this actually working for everybody, and to make adjustments. The bigger the group gets, the harder it is to make adjustments, because at a certain point, it just feels like nothing is actually sticking. With a smaller group, the chances are higher that everyone truly understands why you're making changes. And so it feels more like a natural evolution of a group, instead of a group just kind of uh, going all over the place. So for small groups, setting a lot of time to reflect together and understand what's working and what's not. With small groups, I also like to, schedule a little time for team building that is not focused on the work at all. We're a small group. It's really important that we know each other well and we understand how we work together well. So setting some time to grab coffee or have lunch, or, those things actually do play a role in how the work functions, building that relationship and building that team.
Great. Okay, and I think our last question is, do you have any tips on helping folks narrow down what is a need to function versus an unhelpful norm?
Ooh, hoo, hoo. Um, yes. So a couple of things. One, when you know that there is a tendency to add into the group some of these unhelpful norms, or just carrying over parts of the company culture that are counterintuitive to actually getting the work done. Some things I like to do. One, starting with a really, really small list of norms and agreements. So being very, very specific and very clear. Hey, here are a few things we're going to try first, and then we're going to reflect on how it's going to see if there's anything we need to add. Otherwise, and what I've had happen is it just becomes like everybody's 5 minutes of fame. Like everybody feels like they need to raise their hand and say something. And the phrase that, when I facilitate group, the phrase that people hear me say all the time, I am not handing out any prizes. You get no points for adding to this list. So really being clear with folks, you're not being judged on your ability to add something to this list. You're being asked to be a part of a group, and the whole group is being evaluated on how well it functions, right? The other thing is having a strong facilitator. So someone who can push back and say, hey, is this something that the group needs, or just something that you wanted to note, to call out? You can use a parking lot, so a separate kind of document, a separate kind of space to say, I don't know if that's really a norm or an agreement. How about we put it over here so we're acknowledging it, and then later we'll reflect on it and see if it needs to be woven back in here, right? And that way you give people a little bit more of a feeling like they're heard kind of vibe, and it tends to kind of get people engaged, but just be prepared because they will say, well, what about that thing I said? When are we going to work that in, right? So really finding a way to work in those suggestions. And last but not least, again, reflecting and really leaning on the group to call out things that are not helpful. So really making sure that everyone feels like they have a voice and can say, well, actually, I don't think we need this thing. I think we can take the training wheels off of this and start to build more trust and cohesiveness within the group.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Crystal. Looks like that's the last of our questions for today. So this workshop's come to a close. If you all are interested in receiving the recording and materials from today's free webinar, you can visit our free webinars page on the Nonprofit Learning Lab website, or you can send us an email at program@nonprofitlearninglab.org. Thank you all so much for participating, and thank you again, Crystal, for educating our community.
Thank you.